Okay, so today we are talking about Chamaecyparis thyoides, which is also known as Atlantic White Cedar. Atlantic White Cedar is really only found within a couple dozen miles of the coastline. It is an increasingly rare species to find, but a super important one for our timber industry and really the history of the settlement of America. Again, you're not going to find it very far away from the coast, but if it is near the coast, you might be seeing some other species that are closely related to it. So here's how you tell that what you do have is, in fact, Atlantic White Cedar. First of all, the form is very distinctive. So they have a very straight trunk, and they self-prune the lower branches. And then at the very top, you're going to have the crown that's typically about a quarter or sometimes less of the entire height of the tree. So to me, it kind of looks a lot like an arrow, very arrow-shaped. We have a super conical crown, which is the arrowhead, and then the shaft of the arrow, which is the really long, straight trunk. And so I mentioned the self-pruning of the lower branches. That is an adaptation to periodic fire. And so even though it grows in super wet areas, it actually responds really well, regenerates a lot more after a fire. A lot of species do that. But by self-pruning those lower branches, what it's doing is preventing fire from catching on to those dead stems and then spreading all the way up to the crown. So it's adapted to not, really large catastrophic fires, but more low-intensity ones that would happen more frequently. Historically, this tree was incredibly useful for early settlement and shipbuilding, and it was actually very likely that it was over-harvested to the point of where it's reduced in its abundance to where we have today. So the wood is very rot-resistant and is also really easy to use because, again, it grows really tall and straight, so it's really easy to make timber out of this species. So beyond the form, to identify it, the bark is pretty distinctive. It has this kind of grayish color that, if you look a little closely, is actually kind of reddish. So you can see underneath, oftentimes it'll get this kind of scuzzy, mossy sort of coloration, but if you barely scratch that away, super red in color on the bark. And you can see where the bark has been really ripped away, very red in color. Additionally, the leaves are quite distinctive. And so I grabbed a few samples of other species. So what it is closely related to are two species that we'll find in the Chesapeake Bay watershed: Arborvitae, or northern white cedar, which is commonly used in landscaped settings. It's a very good visual screen because, unlike Atlantic white cedar, those limbs grow all the way down to the ground, so it forms a nice visual screen. And then eastern red cedar, or juniper, a lot of people call it. Eastern red cedar does not grow this nice looking. It's always gnarly, it doesn't grow this tall, but if it's a small or a young individual, then you're going to need to know the difference between the leaves. Like other conifers, we don't have a broadleaf here with Atlantic white cedar, but unlike pines, spruces, hemlocks, things like that, we don't have needles, we actually have scales on all of these species. So here we have our Atlantic white cedar. These very small little green scales with those white edges, those are the leaf tissue of the Atlantic white cedar. Those white edges are a distinguishing feature of Atlantic white cedar, and so again we can compare that to Arborvitae. I grabbed some earlier. So here we can see our Arborvitae, and again you'll see this a lot in landscape settings. It'll hold its splays of leaves very parallel. But Atlantic white cedar, you can see some stick up, some stick out, some stick at angles, but they all are held with those scales sort of in parallel splays. Whereas our juniper, our eastern red cedar, will kind of be way more all over the place than this. It won't be sort of these flat splays like that. So where we are now is actually only a few miles away from the Delaware Bay, but we are in a very swampy little area right next to a stream. We're actually near the town of Cedarville. I'm imagining it's called Cedarville because of all the Atlantic white cedars that grew here at one point in time. It was over-harvested many centuries ago, and with fire suppression, its typical habitat gets taken over by things like red maple that aren't going to allow for the regeneration of the species beneath it. So we're getting less and less of this. So when you do find a stand, you're typically a pretty lucky person, and you must be very close to the beach, making you doubly lucky. Wildlife benefits, birds will eat the cones. They're kind of fleshy, sort of like a juniper, if you've ever seen a juniper berry, but they're very irregularly shaped. Deer will browse on them, but really it's just a really unique, interesting species to have in our forest. And again, very, very high quality timber value, but not really used too often anymore because they're so rare.